Welcome back to Playful Whimsies. Today we are returning to Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, and we are going to read The Selfishness Cure, Chapter 4. Dick Thompson was certainly a nice-looking boy, and he was smart in school and well-behaved, well, at the table. But whenever his name was mentioned, people said, poor Mrs. Thompson, she has such a problem. Whatever shall she do with that child? I guess you would simply feel dreadful if people said a thing like that when your name was mentioned. But Dick didn't. You see, Dick Thompson was a selfish, greedy boy, and he cared about nothing. And he cared more about being a selfish, greedy boy than about what people said. When children came over to his house to play, Dick said, "Don't touch that. That's mine. You can't play with that. That's mine. Put down my ball. Take off my skates." Each time this happened, at least each time it happened where his mother could hear Dick saying, "That's mine," she would send him up to his room to think about how selfish he was. Dick would go right upstairs, for he was very obedient, but instead of thinking of how bad it was to be selfish, he would sit on the bed and swing his legs and think, everything in this room is mine and nobody is going to touch my things. He certainly was a problem. One day, Dick's mother bought a big box of peppermint sticks. She called Dick into the house and said, "Now, dear, I bought this large box of peppermint sticks for you, but I want you to share them with your friends. There are about 50 sticks in the box, and I want you to divide them with all the children in the neighborhood. Don't forget the little children, Dick, and you might send one or two to old Mrs. Bury. She is so fond of peppermint." Dick said, "Thank you, Mother, for the fine candy." Then he took the box out of doors and put it in the basket on the front of his bike and allowed the neighborhood children to look at the peppermint sticks. But he warned them, "This is my candy, and if anyone touches it, I will hit him with my baseball bat." The children in his neighborhood had known Dick for some time, and they knew that he meant what he said, but as they looked at the candy, they wished and wished they could have just one stick. And I'm going to adjust this just a little more so we can see the words a little bit better. Dick's mother, watching from the window, saw all the children gathered around Dick and the box of candy in the basket in the front of his bicycle. She thought to herself, "Just look at my little Dick, dividing the candy with all of his little friends. I just knew he would learn to be generous." She tapped on the window, and when Dick looked around, she waved and smiled at him. Dick waved and smiled back, but unfortunately, just then, Mary O'Toole, who was quite daring, reached in and grabbed a stick of the candy and crack! Dick clouted her on the hand with the baseball bat. In a flash his mother saw what was really going on. She flew out the front door and took Dick firmly by the arm and marched him upstairs, thrust him into his room, and slammed the door. Then she went downstairs out to the front door, took the box of candy, and told Mary O'Toole to divide it among all the children, even the little ones, and to take one or two sticks over to Mrs. Blurry because she was so fond of peppermint. There were 15 children, not counting Dick, and 50 sticks of candy, so each child was given 3 sticks, and old Mrs. Blurry got 5. From the window of his bedroom, Dick watched Mary divide the candy, and he was just furious. After all the candy had been divided, Mrs. Thompson went into the house and called Dick's father. She said, Herbert, I know that you are busy and you don't like me to call you at the office, but I'm so worried about Dick. Dick's father said, "What's the matter? Is he sick?" Dick's mother said, "No, I just wish he were. It would be so much simpler." Mr. Thompson said, "Now, dear, I am very busy, so perhaps you had better wait until I come home." Mrs. Thompson said, "Herbert, this cannot wait another minute," and she told him about the candy and the baseball bat. Mr. Thompson said, "Why not give him a good hard spanking? Tell him that you are going to give him something that he can keep all to himself." Ha ha! Now, Herbert, this is not a laughing matter, and I don't think that a spanking will solve a thing. I just don't know what to do or which way to turn. And Mrs. Thompson began to cry, partly because she felt so humiliated over Dick's selfishness, and partly because she knew crying was one way to get action out of Dick's father. Dick's father said, "Now, dear, tears won't help. Let me see. Shall I hop into a taxi and come home and thrash Dick?" Dick's mother only cried louder. Dick's father said, I know just what I'll do. Call that Miss Piggle-Wiggle or whatever her name is. You know, the one who cured Herbert Prentice." "You mean Miss Piggle-Wiggle? Oh, Herbert, you are so wonderful. I knew you would think of something. I'll call her right away." And Mrs. Thompson blew her nose and cheered right up. Mothers always do cheer up when they think of Miss Piggle-Wiggle because she knows so much about children. After all, she has had about 1,000 little girls and boys come over to her house to pull taffy, play checkers, bake cookies, drink cambric tea, and dig for pirate gold buried in her backyard. And so she has plenty of opportunity to learn about childish ailments and cures for them. She was certainly the person to ask about Dick, the selfish boy, and so Mrs. Thompson telephoned her. She said, "Hello, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. This is Mrs. Thompson, Dick's mother." Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Hello, Mrs. Thompson. I have rather expected you to call." Mrs. Thompson said, "You have? Why?" "Because I know Dick very well," said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, "and although he is a dear little boy and the most well-mannered child who comes to visit me, never once forgetting to say please and thank you, he is very selfish." "Oh, I know he is," said Mrs. Thompson, almost crying because she was so ashamed that Miss Piggle-Wiggle should know how selfish Dick was. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Now, Mrs. Thompson, do not feel sad. Selfishness or greed are just diseases like measles and chicken pox and can be cured very easy. But we must start now before another day passes because Dick is such a nice little boy and we want everyone to like him as we do." "Do you like him in spite of his selfishness?" asked Dick's mother. "Of course I do," said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. "I love all children, but it distresses me when I see a child who has a disease like selfishness or answer-backism or won't put toys away-itis, and his parents don't do a thing to cure him." "But I want to cure Dick," said his mother. "I will do anything to cure him." Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "The selfishness cure is really very simple, but the rules must be followed very strictly. You will have to come down here and get my selfishness kit, and at the same time I will give you directions for its use." "Thank you so much, dear Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle," said Mrs. Thompson. "I will leave right now," and she hung up the phone, slipped on her jacket, and ran all of the way to Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle's house. When she arrived, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle was on the front porch waiting for her. On the porch beside her was quite a large green metal box with Selfishness Kit painted on its side in white letters. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle invited Dick's mother to sit down, and she opened the kit. Inside were about 25 padlocks of various sizes. There were big ones about the size of an apple, down to tiny ones not much larger than a penny. Also, there were screws and a screwdriver, a box of cloth labels that said Dick, a box of blank gummed labels, a small can of white paint, a small can of black paint, a small paintbrush, and a pastry bag. This is a large bag with the nozzle on the end. When filled with frosting, can be squeezed and frosting comes out the end like toothpaste and can be formed into words. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, Miss Thompson, these padlocks are for Dick's drawers, his clothes, his toy chest, his bicycle, his bedroom door, his nightstand drawer, and his toothbrush. As soon as you get home, put the padlocks on everything he owns and give him the keys. This is to assure him that he and he alone can touch his things. The name labels are to be sewn in all of his clothes, and the gum stickers are to be put in all of his books, even his school books, notebooks, pencil boxes, and are even to be pasted on his ruler, crayons, and paints. On each sticker, print in large letters with this black paint, Dick's book, don't touch. Dick's notebook, don't touch, and so forth. On every toy he owns, you must paint in either black or white paint. Dick's ball, don't touch, or Dick's bat, don't touch. Put the name of the toy first, then don't touch. The pastry bag is to be filled with simple white frosting and used to mark Dick's sandwiches, his fruit, his cookies, and his plate for each meal. That's all there is to it. I expect you will be returning the Selfishness kit before a week passed. Mrs. Thompson said, I do hope so, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. Are you sure it will work? It has cured hundreds of children, and I see no reason why it should not cure Dick. In a week or even less, I should say. Mrs. Thompson thanked Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle very much, and then, lugging the kit, she walked home. As soon as she had hung up her jacket, she began sewing labels in all of Dick's clothes. He asked her what she was doing, and when she showed him, he was as happy as could be. Boy, that will just show people who owns my clothes, he said proudly. Mrs. Thompson did not answer, but continued to put the labels on every stitch of his clothing, including socks and his handkerchiefs. Then she opened the kit and took out the tiniest padlock. She fastened Dick's toothbrush to the toothbrush rack with the little padlock and snapped it shut and handed the key, which was not much bigger than a pin, to Dick. You had better find a ring to hold your keys, she said. You are going to have about 25 of them. Boy, that's just wonderful, Dick said, fondling the tiny keys and thinking, my toothbrush, and now nobody but me can touch it. He was very happy. When dinner time came, Mrs. Thompson closed the Selfishness kit and took it downstairs to show Dick's father. She told him about Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, and he patted her on the back and said he was sure everything was going to be all right, and where was the evening paper? After dinner, they went upstairs to put some of the padlocks on and were surprised to find Dick himself had already put the locks on each of his bureau drawers, his nightstand drawer, his toy box, his closet door, and his bedroom door. He had also put stickers on the covers of all of his books, notebooks, coloring books, crayon, and colored pencil boxes, and stamp album. On the stickers he had printed in black paint, Dick's book, don't touch. Dick's notebook, don't touch. Dick's crayons, don't touch. Dick's pencil box, don't touch. Dick's stamp album, don't touch. He was very proud and asked his father if he didn't think he printed well. His father said, "You should be able to print well. You've certainly practiced enough." And he looked disgustedly around the room at all the stickers which labeled everything. Dick's brush, don't touch. Dick's combs, don't touch. Dick's window blind, don't touch. He turned to Dick's mother and said, "Perhaps we should." Wear stickers. Dick's mother, don't touch. Dick's father, don't touch. I bet he'll wear monogram underwear when he grows up. Mrs. Thompson said, "Oh, I certainly hope not, Hubert." Dick's mother said, "Come on, Mom and Dad, let's mark all the rest of my stuff." So they worked until 8:30, marking Dick's bicycle, his baseball, his bat, his pitcher's glove, his catcher's glove, his toolbox, his roller skates, his lunchbox, his rubber boots, his raincoat, his Indian suit, his soldier suit, his gun, and his wagon. They even painted Dick's dog, "Don't Touch," on Rover's collar. When they had finished and it was time for Dick to go to bed, he kissed his mother and said good night to his father and went happily upstairs, his ring of keys jangling from his belt. Mr. Thompson sank down into a chair in the living room and lit his pipe. "I trust that Miss Piggle-Wiggle knows what she is doing," he said, "because if this cure should not work, our son Dick is going to be the most loathsome boy in the whole world." Mrs. Thompson said, "Oh no, dear, not in the whole world." The next morning they heard Dick clanking and snapping at his padlocks long before they were up. He was a little late coming downstairs because it took time to padlock all of his drawers, his closet door, and the door of his room, but he was very happy, and his mother noticed that he had pinned one of the same labels outside of his sweater while he was eating his breakfast, marked "Dick's breakfast, don't touch." His mother marked his sandwiches, "Dick's sandwiches, don't touch," and his apple, "Dick's apple, don't touch," and all of his cookies, "Dick's cookies, don't touch." His lunchbox had already been marked, "Dick's lunchbox, don't touch." After breakfast, Dick put the lunchbox in the basket on his bicycle and noticed proudly the large sign hanging from the crossbar, "Dick's bicycle, don't touch." All this at school, the children paid little attention to the sign on his bicycle, but when he opened his lunchbox and took out the sandwiches marked "Dick's sandwiches, don't touch," and the apple marked "Dick's apple, don't touch," and the cookies marked "Dick's cookies, don't touch," everyone laughed and wanted to see them, and in the resulting crowding and pushing, one of the sandwiches was dropped and stepped on, and one of the big boys grabbed the apple and tossed it in the air above Dick's head, shouting, "Throw me Dick's apple! Oh, look, I dropped Dick's apple. I wonder if Dick's apple will bounce." When they finally gave Dick his apple, it was bruised and very dirty. In arithmetic period that afternoon, Bobby Slater across the aisle asked Dick for his ruler, and when he saw the label, sorry, I didn't mean to get ahead of you. "Dick's ruler, don't touch," he began to laugh and reach over and snatched the ruler off Dick's desk and passed it to Kenny Hatch, who laughed and passed it to the girl in front. And finally, Miss Crabtree had to come down and get it. When she saw the sign too, she laughed, but she gave the ruler back to Dick. After school, the boys decided to play baseball in the vacant lot by Dick's house, but when Dick brought out his bat and ball and mitts, and the boys saw Dick's ball, "Don't touch," Dick's bat, "Don't touch," they said, "We can't touch anything, so let's go home." And they did. Dick went up to his room to play, but he found that somewhere during the day he had lost his key to his closet, and he had locked the key to his toy chest in the chest. So he went down and sat on the front porch and listened to the shouts of the children playing in Herbert Prentice's yard. The next morning at school, during recess, nobody would play with him, and the little girls followed him and laughed. When they marched into school, the children pointed and laughed, and Miss Crabtree had to come down and see what the trouble was, and she almost laughed herself when she saw someone had pinned on the back of Dick's sweater, "This is Dick, don't touch." At lunchtime, children crowded around to watch him take out his sandwiches, and one girl said, "He's so..." Let's see what she says. Sorry about that. Yep. "Selfish and greedy. He has his sandwiches marked so he can't share them." Then the children danced around him and chanted, "Dick's sandwich don't touch, Dick's apple don't touch, Dick's lunchbox don't touch." Finally, Dick took his lunchbox out and put it in the little basket on his bicycle, but the children followed him, and seeing the big sign, "Dick's bicycle don't touch," they yelled and laughed and sang, "Dick's don't touch, Dick's don't touch Dick, Dick's don't touch Dick's." Dick. After Dick hurried right home, he had lost the key to his room, so he went down to the basement to play with his toolbox, but every time he saw the large white sign, "Dick's toolbox don't touch," he thought of school in the lunchbox, and he remembered how the children laughed and jeered, and he was ashamed. At dinner, when his mother brought him his plate marked "Dick's dinner don't touch," he said, "Why do you have to mark my plate? I don't care which one I get." Mrs. Thompson looked significantly at Mr. Thompson and said, "All right, Dick, we won't mark your plate if you will share your dessert with Rover." Dick thought for a few minutes, and then he carefully broke his chocolate cake into 2 pieces and gave one to Rover, who gulped it down and looked grateful. Now, keep in mind this was written quite a while ago, and Dick is short for Richard. I'm sure there are other names that it's also short for. Also, at the time, nobody knew that that most dogs are allergic to chocolate. So just be aware. Don't give your dog chocolate. After dinner, Dick told his father he has lost the keys to his room and the closet, so his father took off the padlock on those doors and on the toy box. Dick said, "Don't put them back, Dad. I don't care who goes into my room or gets into my stuff." The next morning, Dick got up early and scraped the Dick's lunchbox "Don't touch" from his lunchbox and took the sign off his bicycle. Then he went to his mother and said, "Mom, please don't mark my sandwiches. Please don't mark any of my stuff, Mom." Mrs. Thompson said, "All right, Dick, I only did it to protect you." Dick said, "I don't care who gets my lunch, just don't mark it." At noon, all the children gathered around Dick, but neither his sandwiches nor his apple nor his lunchbox were marked, so they rushed out to see his bicycle, but there was no sign on it, so they sat down and ate their lunches. Right after school that night, Dick hurried home and scraped the markings off his ball and bats and mitts, and then he walked to where the children were playing ball and tossing the ball, mitts, bat and mitts down beside the catcher, he said, "Do you want to use these? I don't care." He went back to his house. In a little while Mary O'Toole rang the doorbell and asked Mrs. Thompson if Dick could come out and play. Mrs. Thompson said he'd love to, Mary, but first he must return something to Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. Mary said, "Tell him to come over to the lot when he gets back, and here are some keys he lost." Mrs. Thompson said, "Thank you for the keys, dear, but thank goodness they belong to Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, not Dick." She took off the big padlocks and the tiny padlocks up. She took the keys of the big padlocks and the tiny padlocks up to Dick, who was in his room, busy packing Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle's selfishness kit. And that is the end of the selfishness cure. And next week, we will be reading the radish cure. I hope you have enjoyed this Playful Whimsies. I understand that sometimes my words get tangled up when I am reading. I have a learning issue called dyslexia. So there are times when what I see, my eyes see things differently, and my brain doesn't receive it the way that other people see it. So it took me a long time to learn how to read. It took me a lot longer than other people in my age, and so now I practice reading as much as I can. I absolutely love it. There's so much to learn, and there's so much to read about, and I just want to share my love of reading with you. And these are just some of the fun books. I'm going to be getting into other books, but for now, I'm sticking to children's books. Give me a little more experience to read out loud, and I'm hoping to make a really nice and fun YouTube channel that just keeps on going. So I really do hope you've enjoyed this Playful Whimsies today, and have a beautiful day. Goodbye.